Wonderful. Greetings, everyone, and welcome to this event. My name is Susanna Clark, and I'm the director of the Mahindra Humanities Center and the Morton B. Knopfel Professor of Music here at Harvard University. It is my very great pleasure to welcome you all today to this evening's celebration of Ernesto Londoño's new book, Trippy, The Peril and Promise of Medicinal Psychedelics, which was published earlier this year. It's great to see some of you with it in your hands. Today is part of the Study of Psychedelics in Society and Culture initiative, which is an interdisciplinary effort across the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, the Harvard Law School, and the Harvard Divinity School. The series at the Mahindra Humanities Center aims to enrich our understanding of psychedelics and their implications for human experiences across histories, cultures, and geographies. This initiative is supported by a generous and indeed visionary gift from the Gracias Family Foundation. For help in the arrangements for today's event, I'm also grateful to Steve Beal, the executive director of the Mahindra Humanities Center, and to Lindsay Fraze, who is the project coordinator for the Psychedelics Initiative. I'm also grateful to the extended Mahindra Humanities staff team who work together for every event. And I'm extremely pleased to reveal that today's event was the suggestion of one of our staff members, Lisa Brown. So thank you for that. And I'm excited to introduce our guests today. Ernesto Londoño is a national correspondent at the New York Times, where he has worked since 2014. He began his career at the Dallas Morning News and then worked at the Washington Post, where his assignments included the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, the Arab Spring, and the Pentagon. His book, Trippy, as I'm sure many of you know, blends both a personal experience and journalistic research. Part memoir, it reflects on his own experiences and transformation as he sought relief from severe depression through a psychedelic retreat in the Brazil rainforest in 2018. The book is also an investigation into the various groups touched by the modern day rise and popularity of psychedelic medicine, including startups, therapists, veterans, religious leaders, healers, and indigenous populations, amongst others. Ernesto's clear-eyed journalistic perspective on the healing potentials of psychedelics, their ethical and social implications, and the troubling corruption and greed that grows with their popularity is an absolutely profound and, if I may say, brave contribution to the current debates on psychedelics. Joining us today to guide the conversation is an award-winning journalist, Ellen Berry. She's a reporter for the New York Times with an expertise in covering mental health. During her career at the New York Times, she has served as bureau chief in Moscow, Delhi, and Boston, and as chief international correspondent in London. Prior to joining the New York Times in 2007, she worked for the Moscow Times, the Boston Phoenix, the Boston Globe, and the Los Angeles Times. She has been a Pulitzer finalist numerous times, including while at the Boston Globe, for writing on mental health among neglected people within Massachusetts. And indeed, in 2011, she won a Pulitzer along with her colleague, Clifford Levy, for international reporting on the justice system in Russia. So thank you all for joining us today, and I look forward to today's conversation. And so please join me in welcoming Ernesto Londoño and Ellen Berry. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susie. What a treat to be here. I think this is the closest I'll ever get to be able to say that I got into Harvard.
So I will enjoy this hour tremendously. And it's also a delight to share the stage with Ellen Berry, who I always read with a mix of admiration and envy. She also happens to have gone to an Ivy League herself, and we're not going to disclose the name. But I'm really thrilled that she's here. She was one of the early readers of the manuscript and gave me feedback that was really helpful and reassuring. So to kick off, I'm going to read some pages from some of the second chapter of the book. And before I get into that, I'll give you kind of just a little bit of background about how the book came about. When I moved to Brazil in 2017, initially I was very excited. This felt like, sort of a really great assignment after, a career spent in, sometimes not terribly great places like Iraq and Afghanistan. So, I thought I had it made, and I thought I was sort of at the top of my game, and I got an apartment in Rio with this gorgeous view of the ocean. But soon after arriving there and trying to get my bearings in a new city, in a new country, navigating a new language, I became really, really depressed. And depression had been something, that I'd lived with before, but, I developed pretty reliable coping mechanisms. And this was the first time where, the things I used to do to sort of get myself out of a hole were no longer working. So I was feeling so despondent that it was really hard to get out of bed in the morning. I started having thoughts of self-harm that began very subtly and then turned into actual plans. So I was feeling really, really low. And at the time when I arrived in Brazil, I had a handful of story ideas. And among those was exploring this booming psychedelic retreat field in Latin America. I had had a conversation with a psychiatrist at Yale who was a colleague of my sister's. And he'd mentioned he'd done some field work recently, and in particular, he mentioned that American veterans were going on retreats in the jungle. So this was really interesting to me, and I kind of filed that away as something I wanted to explore journalistically. But one night, probably in the fall of 2017, where I was having a sleepless night, and I probably had too much whiskey trying to get to sleep, about 4 a.m, after not being able to sleep, I cracked my computer open and I Googled ayahuasca retreats Brazil and found this really strange and loopy YouTube video recorded by an Argentine psychotherapist who became one of the pioneers of the psychedelic retreat field in Latin America. Her name is Sylvia. And, if you look at the video now, it sounds bonkers, and there's a lot of sort of crazy talk and a lot of special effects in the video, but there was something really hope-inducing in the video, and especially in her voice. It was just so reassuring and almost motherly and almost like trance-inducing. And I woke up the next morning and filed an application online to partake in one of her retreats. And, fast forward a few weeks, I showed up at her place. This retreat came with some strange rules, like you had to, stop drinking alcohol 2 weeks before. You had to change your diet to start eating only plant-based meals and no salt. You had to abstain from all sorts of sex. And, one funny rule was that you should stop reading the news, which was really hard for me since I was producing the news up until the day I flew there. So, I walk in and I'm, somewhat hopeful and very intrigued, but also very skeptical. And these pages are about the very first ceremony that I participated in. Some 15 cots were arranged in a circle in the Maloca, the circular ceremony room with a cone-shaped ceiling. Each was outfitted with a pillow, a neatly folded blanket, and a bucket to vomit into. As we picked our spots in the room, trading nervous glances, Sylvia and Rohan, her assistant, whispered as they poured ayahuasca into shot glasses. They rely on intuition in deciding how big of a dose will be right for each person, a process that often leads to bargaining and pleas for a more generous pour. I was relieved to get a light dose that first night. When Sylvia handed me the glass, I brought it up to my nose. The smell of the thick, dark brown sludge was revolting. Sylvia had us stand in a circle for a quick guided meditation to set an intention for the ceremony. Imagine roots shooting down from your feet to the center of the earth, Sylvia said. The roots needed to be long and thick to keep us grounded. I was done playing Sylvia's game by now, so I rolled my eyes discreetly and made no effort to sprout imaginary roots. Each participant then had to share an intention. Princess, who's a woman from Texas, who was one of the Loop Year retreat participants, Princess began referring to the medicine as Mother Ayahuasca. For fuck's sake, I thought. But she was far from alone. Virtually everyone else who had been down this path personified ayahuasca as a wise, elder, feminine force that was about to enter our bodies like a sacrament. When it came time to share my intention, I said I wanted to understand what had brought me here. It was simple and felt genuine enough. When the last participant spoke, Sylvia asked us to head back to our cots and raise our glasses. "Have a good journey," she said, as the lights were dimmed. I drank my serving in one gulp. The taste was acrid. My eyes watered as I fought the urge to puke. Sylvia began playing gentle music that seemed to be in sync with the sounds of the jungle that poured in through the mesh surrounding the maloca. Frogs croaked, birds chirped, insects wailed. Maybe I was imagining it, but there seemed to be a rhythm to the cacophony of jungle sounds. After a while, the wild symphony sounded like the planet's beating heart. Conjuring that image reminded me of my own medicine-deprived heart. I forgot to mention I'd gone off blood pressure medicine. I placed one hand on it and felt its beat quicken. Sylvia's music changed abruptly, and suddenly the room was filled with the pounding of drums. I began worrying that my nervous system was being dangerously revved up and wondered what a stroke would feel like. Would I even notice it coming on amid all this noise? But then the colors appeared, instantly blasting away the heaviness of fear and the tyranny of thoughts. They were faint streaks of pink and blue at first, unfolding like symmetrical figures in a kaleidoscope. The colors became brighter, the outlines sharper, and the shapes more ornate with every passing moment. I felt paralyzed, surrendering to the majesty of these mysterious visions. Were they a product of my mind? Gifts from another realm? Evidence that Princess was onto something? Or was this simply what it felt like to be on drugs? I noticed I was smiling as I pondered these questions. Then I felt the unexpected flow of tears that drifted onto the pillow from the corner of my eyes. It didn't feel like conventional crying. There was no heavy breathing, no tightness in my chest, and not a hint of sadness. I had never felt lighter, less burdened. For a few precious moments, the fog of depression cleared, its shackles suddenly unclasped.
So as Ernesto mentioned, I was one of the early readers of this book. And as we were preparing for this conversation tonight, he said something that surprised me, which is that when he sent me the book, he was nervous because he was worried that by writing about his experience with psychedelics, he was going to damage his career. And that kind of surprised me to hear. But you have now had a few months as someone telling this story to all kinds of crowds. And I wonder what you have learned about whether it is safe to come out of the closet on psychedelics. Is it safe to talk about it in a professional context? And who's told you about their own experiences?
That's a great question. So a lot of people have come out of the psychedelics closet, especially at the New York Times, which has been really revelatory. So I'm, taking copious notes, so I have an inventory of who's disclosed what. No. But no, this was scary, and I thought long and hard about whether I wanted to do this, because I was effectively attaching two loaded words to my reputation: depression and drug use. And even though, I think there's less stigma about speaking openly about these issues, I think those are still very loaded terms, and they carry a lot of baggage. So I was worried about whether people would see me differently, whether people would see me as somebody who, could no longer be trusted with conventional journalism, and thought long and hard about that, especially as the book was about to come out. The feedback, though, has been very reassuring, and one of the things that has been really surprising and meaningful is how many people who, I knew very sort of marginally have opened up in really profound ways after reading the book, and sort of, felt that they could trust me with something that was really tender or difficult about them. And it's really strengthened a lot of my friendships, but also relationships with people that I knew, just as acquaintances. So that's been definitely a really wonderful and unexpected piece of birthing this book.
So it's safer than you thought it was. But is it safe?
I mean, I think it still carries a lot of stigma. One thing that became clear to me as I was doing reporting for the book is a lot of the people, especially in the research lane, a lot of the, scholars doing psychedelics research, will tell you off the record that, they came to this field and that their sort of work is informed by their personal experience, but they won't disclose that publicly. They feel like it will tarnish or compromise the integrity of their work, or the perception of, whether or not they're serious scholars or true believers.
When you sat down to write this book, it was with a good deal of confidence that FDA approval was coming for MDMA, and that this would then open a new avenue for serious, rigorous discussion of the benefits and risks. But it didn't turn out that way.
Yeah,
And
so I'm sorry, go ahead.
First question is sort of, what was the blind spot? Why was there such confidence that approval was coming?
So I kind of see the past few years as, I think like the psychedelic spring began with Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind, which came out in 2018, and, really kind of galvanized what had been a somewhat underground community and gave people confidence to speak openly and, be more forward-leaning and trying to sort of urge people to reconsider how we treat these compounds from a legal, regulatory, and culture perspective. I think the period during which I was writing the book is like the psychedelic summer, where everybody was ebullient and, making huge plans and investing millions of dollars. Ketamine was the first thing that kind of got off the ground and became a bricks and mortars sort of industry. It seemed a foregone conclusion that the FDA would approve MDMA as a treatment for PTSD. And I think people kind of assumed that that was just going to be the first crack in prohibition of psychedelics, and that psilocybin would be, next in line. And that you would have these compounds integrated and firmly rooted in mainstream medicine. But I think, we started seeing some skepticism. Maybe last year is when it intensified in the lead up to the decision by the FDA about MDMA. And I think what happened was there was a recognition that some of the people who had been conducting these studies were first and foremost combatants in the war on drugs, and were sort of primarily motivated by a desire to do away with prohibition. And I think there was a sense that tainted the integrity of the science. I think there's also a recognition among, psychiatrists and neurologists that these compounds are really wily. It's not easy to replicate results. if you take, 6 grams of mushroom and I take 6 grams of mushroom and we both meet the diagnostic criteria for depression, we're unlikely to experience the same thing. So I think medicine has had a really, really hard time really nailing down how to think about both the potential and the harms of these compounds. And ultimately, the health regulators felt like the science was not quite there.
In the absence of a pathway to sort of clinical, regulated medical use of these substances, there's sort of 2 pathways that remain. One is going to retreats, going to you describe a real Wild West of retreats. And the other is no use of psychedelics at all. So what's better?
Yeah, when I was working on the book, I think there was a huge amount of interest and momentum in what I thought of as the medical clinical lane. And people were very optimistic. There was a lot of money being funneled there. But there was also the spiritual lane, which was growing really, really quickly. And, I think what happened over the past few years is many people who either had psychedelic experiences or had been working as psychedelic guides in the underground learned about the really interesting and rich case law that has sort of supported the notion that some of these compounds can be used as sacraments and have inherent spiritual value in certain communities, and decided that they would start operating openly and see how much they could get away with. And I think what they learned is they could get away with a lot. Because from a law enforcement standpoint, there seems to be very little appetite in cracking down on these communities, and after going after practitioners who are doing this work in spiritual or religious settings, or at least asserting that that is what they are doing. And that is because, when the government has tried to fight these communities and go after them, it's tended to lose a legal battle because religious freedom laws have become so robust in this country. So where we find ourselves now is the clinical lane has, throttled, and there's, I think, a lot less money and a lot less momentum there, and a lot of questions about, how do you get this rock up the hill? And on the other hand, the spiritual lane is very, very fertile soil. And the people who are interested in this oftentimes are people who've had bad or disappointing experiences with mainstream medicine. And not only do they see this as an alternative, but they see this as a preferable alternative to trying, things like antidepressants or psychotherapy or things along those lines. So now we have a wide open lane on the spiritual front, for the time being, and, kind of limited action happening on the clinical and research lane.
And if someone wants mental health treatment, is it safe for them to take that sort of spiritual path? Is it appropriate? So
the spiritual path is really wondrous and fascinating, but it has, very little in the way of guardrails. So, in some places, if you happen to stumble upon a community led by people who are, acting ethically and who have deep experience, and, especially people who have learned from indigenous people about these rituals and about how to do this kind of work with great care and devotion, you might have a great experience, and it can be tremendously healing. But if you are somebody who's extraordinarily vulnerable and you start kind of scanning what the marketplace has to offer, it's very easy for you to stumble into a place where the practitioner is either in over their head and kind of making, the rules up as they go, or predatory. This is a field where there's been a pattern of sexual abuse targeting people who, put their faith in rapists, but also, predatory behavior around finances, or even sort of cult-like dynamics where once you kind of enter into these spaces, you're manipulated and sort of steered into things that are not going to ultimately be healthy for you.
One of my very favorite things about this book, which if you haven't read, you really should, is the tension between Ernesto's profound belief that this can work when everything else has failed, and his real wariness about some of the people who are selling it. And how vulnerable, as you said, people make themselves in relationship to these guides, who in many cases, as you document, are charlatans. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if there is a way to structure these experiences that avoids this kind of power dynamic, this dangerous power dynamic, or is the level of trust that is required just too high?
I mean, I think there's been a number of efforts to have sort of best practices and, things like, very careful and thoughtful screening of the people who are coming into these spaces. But whereas we have, ways of regulating medicine and, kind of the behavior of a psychotherapist, for instance, like the rules of the road for those fields and those professions are pretty clear. And there's kind of broad agreement that there should be boundaries. If this is being practiced in a spiritual context, we as a country have decided that the government should be really hands-off when it comes to spiritual communities. So that leaves us with a scenario where you have spiritual or so-called spiritual practitioners straddling interventions that are a little spiritual but a little medicinal, and definitely, billed as medicinal or therapeutic interventions, but also kind of enjoy the status quo, that the government, has a really high bar when it comes to what it can, what kind of rules it can set for these communities. So I don't think that there's a really easy solution to this. If what you are left with is a bunch of psychedelic churches offering therapy, it's neither inherently medicinal in a way that you can kind of come in and regulate it and create parameters, and it's not entirely spiritual. I want to show just a handful of photos and a short clip of a video to just give you a taste of what this actually looks like and feels like. And like a couple of things you'll see is one thing that makes this really distinct from therapy is there's a lot of warmth and touch that happens in these spaces. Most of the photos I'm going to show you are from a church in Austin run by a woman called Whitney, who had just been up and running for a few months when, I contacted her and she agreed to come let me be a fly on the wall for one of her retreats. And at the time she was working primarily with veterans and veterans who were acutely distressed. So one of the first people I met was a veteran who had tried to kill himself just 2 weeks before by putting a pistol in his mouth and had been stalked. So it kind of gives you a sense of the kind of lives that intersect in the psychedelics Wild West, but also kind of the intensity of some of these interventions. One thing that they do is they really get to sort of the core, the crux of people suffering really, really quickly in a way that SSRIs and psychotherapy does not. And Sean, when I met him when he went to the retreat, he had no experience with this stuff. He looked like a dead man walking. He just had these kind of glassy eyes, spoke in like monotone, and just looked like a ghost. He also had really debilitating physical pain. And I've tracked him because I'm interested in kind of making sense of how long these interventions last and whether people really feel as good as they report the morning after 6 months down the line. And he's doing really well. Like this was a before and after for him. And he had tried everything in the conventional toolbox and had really soured on what the VA was doing to him, which was at one point putting him on 17 different pills.
One of the really striking scenes in your book is a retreat that you went on at a Santa Daime church.
Yep.
And you came in with enormous resistance because you were sour on religion generally, raised Catholic, like a lot of us. And But I'll just read a few sentences from that scene. The last vestiges of judgment, skepticism, and unease I had walked in with the day before receded. Their absence created space for an incandescent sense of peace, and within it I felt overflowing with love. So, was this a religious experience?
Yes.
Did it mark a reconciliation with faith?
I think that was a turning point for me in which I realized that being devoid of any real spiritual practice is not a smart way to go through life, at least for me. And I think having covered wars in which religion played a role, I had really kind of soured and become wary of organized religion. And felt very comfortable that I was, either agnostic or atheist or somewhere in that spectrum. But I think the experience at the Santo Daime Church made me realize the power of community and of people coming together to participate in rituals, and also expanded my sense of what was possible. And one thing I started to do was, lean into prayer. Early on after my first psychedelic experiences, I began meditating and found that enormously helpful and became really interested in Buddhism and Eastern traditions. And that became like a really useful way of kind of resetting my relationship with my thinking mind and the ways my thoughts became feelings and became beliefs. But I think dabbling in those circles, entering those circles where people, do this in a far more religious container, planted the seeds of something deeper. And I began praying, and praying became such a simple and powerful thing. I began being in dialogue with my father, who was dead, and grandparents who were no longer walking on the earth. And I don't need to know whether or not it's true that there's still some sort of a portal to reach out to people who are no longer here. But just the mere act of allowing yourself to have that dialogue and to be, sort of allow yourself to feel their presence and to imagine that maybe they can watch over us was enormously comforting. And it's such an easy thing to do if you just kind of allow yourself to expand the bounds of your belief system.
How many retreats have you been on now?
I've lost count, but I probably have participated in, 65 plus ceremonies.
You describe very carefully the jeopardy that people are in some cases.
Yeah.
Were you ever in jeopardy?
What do you mean exactly?
Of predatory guides or exploitation. You just describe this power dynamic that returns again and again, where people really hand over their trust.
Yep. The short answer is no. I think, the first place I went to, run by this woman, Sylvia, I consider her to be, one of the more ethical and knowledgeable practitioners in this field. And she asks nothing of people when they walk out the door. She just wishes them well. And then I think when I ventured into places that were thornier, like a crazy retreat in Costa Rica where people are guaranteed an actual miracle if they can afford it, I went in with eyes wide open. And there were times when my defenses were eroding a little bit, and I became kind of susceptible to some of the marketing and some of the, spiritual indoctrination that happens in some of those communities. But I never felt that they really kind of took me to places or steered me toward beliefs or behaviors that were unhealthy for me. But it required a lot of mindfulness. It required a lot of just being intentional about where I was going, why I was doing it, and then just kind of returning back to baseline.
I kept wondering as I was reading your accounts of these retreats, when you were stepping back into your reporter brain, and when you were Ernesto. And I wondered, does that division still exist?
Well, it doesn't anymore because I'm done with the book. It was really, really hard. I think, the first few years when I was going on these retreats, as somebody who was really interested in building on the progress I'd made and getting to know myself better and finding, insights and, sort of changes in behavior that would make me more resilient. I was very earnest and I took it very, very seriously, and this became a form of therapy and introspection. When I shifted gears and started going on some of these experiences as a journalist, I was still doing part of that work, but I was also very focused on the task at hand, which was to record and to think of what each retreat would look like as a chapter in the book. And it was really difficult to try to do those two things simultaneously, because when you're stoned, it's really hard to work. But I think once I was done with the book, I kind of felt like psychedelics were not something I was going to need habitually. I felt like a lot of the lessons that had been really helpful had been delivered loud and clear. And this wasn't something that I felt like I would need to, use as a crutch or a tool every 6 months or so.
I think as we consider psychedelics within sort of the medical context or within regulatory or establishment context, there's a problem, which is the sense that people who are doing the research or funding the research are themselves true believers, and that in service of that goal, that they may cut corners or they may sand down the sort of academic rigor, scientific rigor that we expect. So is that a problem? Is there any merit to that objection?
It's a problem. I think a lot of the people who have become really interested and are either, inserting themselves in the field as scholars or researchers, a lot of the participants who have signed up for these clinical trials, I think it's fair to say that they're primed to assume that these things work. So I think it creates a little bit of sort of an echo chamber of optimism. And it's not to say that they don't work. I do believe they do work, but I think especially for people who are primed to think that these things are helpful and therapeutic. But if and when this gets rolled out to the general public, I think the results we've seen in some of the early clinical research is unlikely to be replicated at scale. I just think the people who have come together to participate and lead these studies are not representative of the broader population. I do think there's a problem. And I also think the fact that these compounds remain illegal just makes it really thorny, because the war on drugs is very contentious and for very good reasons. So when you have people who are pursuing this and deeply motivated by a deeply held belief that the war on drugs is immoral and should be done away with, their approach to the scientific process is not going to be entirely impartial. They're going to want to see positive results.
Because we are in Massachusetts, I have to ask you, we are a few days out from a big vote. Massachusetts would be the third state after Oregon and Colorado to legalize the use of 5 psychedelic substances. Is Massachusetts important in the big picture? How would it be different from the states that preceded it?
I think it's a bellwether of where public opinion stands on this issue. And I also think it's a bellwether of just how much the medical community has become increasingly skeptical of the direction this is taking. It looks like the polling looks like it could go either way. It's evenly split. But, I do think these experiments in something that is, neither underground nor, kind of entirely medicalized and done by medical professionals is a really interesting and, arguably kind of worthwhile middle lane. And it's in its infancy. So, only in Oregon can people now walk into a bricks and mortar facility and undergo psilocybin treatment with somebody who's licensed and somebody who's following certain guidelines. I do think, given that many people are desperate enough to pursue these treatments, and given that the culture has changed, I think, in ways that are going to be really hard to put back in the bottle, it may be helpful to have a space that is going to be safer, that's going to be above board, and, critically, that could give scientists sort of a deeper sense of patient outcomes over time. So right now, we only have Oregon and Colorado who have taken that step. I think if Massachusetts were to take that step, I think it would open a really useful window to better understand the promise, the limitation, and the dangers of this thing. But it's also clear that a lot of people think it's a bad idea, and that doing so would sort of fuel the sense that these tools are safe, that they're inherently benign, and may lead people to sort of self-medicate with greater confidence.
Right. I wonder, what assurance is there that in the event of legalization, this will not mainly drive people towards recreational rather than therapeutic use?
Well, let me tell you, there's nothing recreational about ayahuasca. I don't know. I mean, I think we're in a moment where, especially in big cities, these compounds have become so accessible that people are already doing this. And, much of the population is now operating under the assumption that if these things aren't, strictly legal, they're no longer inaccessible and they're unlikely to face criminal penalties. The fact that Whitney has been operating her church and promoting herself on Instagram and has a website advertising exactly what she's doing, and the DA has not come knocking on her door, I think gives you a sense of where we are on this issue, which is, kind of a tacit, don't ask, don't tell, I think, policy that these players are, operating under. So I don't know if if all these compounds became legal overnight, then the other question is, how do you regulate them? Do you treat them like alcohol? Do you just allow people to sort of grow them, but, limit the extent to which they can be advertised and marketed? These are all difficult questions, and we're not even close to getting to a point where those conversations can be had.
How does Whitney talk about the law?
Whitney is a true believer. She is somebody who feels so deeply in her core that her past and her trauma, led her to become a healer, and that she is the person who was catching some of the most vulnerable and in distress people. And she has a remarkable and unshakable sense of faith in her and in these compounds. So as far as I can tell, she's somebody who was fearless. And I think she also is representative of the kind of people who are shaping this field, which tend to be the biggest risk takers. Mm-hmm. And that in and of itself kind of makes this dicey, because you don't necessarily want the people who are the biggest risk takers creating the models and getting ahead of their skis, because things do go wrong. And when they do go wrong, oftentimes these people are not really equipped to handle them responsibly.
I think we should open it up to questions from the audience. I think we probably have some great ones out there. You want to go first?
Yeah. Hi, I'm Franklin. I'm a psychiatrist and psychedelic researcher at Mass General Hospital across the river in Boston. One thing that I just wanted to speak to, I'd be curious if you could, I think it would be really helpful for you to speak a little bit to the audience about what we witnessed in that video. Mm-hmm. because I think one of the nuances that just continues to be lost, as you alluded to, we went through the media hyping psychedelics to now the media denigrating them. And I don't think the media has been particularly responsible in drawing the distinction between the fact that psychedelics, allegations of exceptionalism aside or not, are different from other drugs. We consider drugs things that we take and they do something to you. We don't think of what you do while you're on the drug, your interaction with the drug, as mattering.
Right.
I give somebody who's having a panic attack Xanax. It doesn't matter if they fight it. It doesn't matter what they think about. They're going to stop having a panic attack. But psychedelics are totally different. There's the person element. And I think what we witnessed was really intense stuff. Mm-hmm. And I think that we have a great deal of difficulty entering into really deep emotional space in our culture. And so I don't want to be, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I don't want to be complicit in our society's tendency to not really kind of go deep, because I think that's really the barrier that psychedelics take. So I think it would be really helpful if we could just hear a little bit more about what it was that we witnessed and why you showed that, because that really captures the real intensity of this medicine.
Yeah, I mean, I think when people are in the grip of trauma, like if, somebody is struggling with PTSD or somebody's just, severely depressed, it's really hard to kind of rationalize what you're experiencing and think your way into kind of solutions. So every psychedelic trip is different, and as I said earlier, it's really hard to sort of replicate results. But I think what we saw that was a very compelling example of somebody who is able to zero in on something that becomes really, really clear to him. One of the things he was, there were kind of three things that came from that trip for him. One is, I didn't deserve it, which meant he didn't deserve to get raped. And it was almost like going back to sort of this inner child mode and the tenderness and vulnerability of that moment, and understanding that what happened was not his fault, and kind of, dealing with that anger and the intensity of those emotions that for somebody who has PTSD or trauma gets sort of shoved aside. Then he kind of made the leap of saying, I now know what love is. And he kind of said, I'd been so sort of, I'd created such a wall around my trauma because these feelings were so impossible to deal with in real time that I, had not felt love for myself or the love of other people. And so in this kind of like emotionally cracked open space, he feels this sense of radiant love. And then the last thing, which you didn't see in that clip of the video, but was at the end, he kind of said, I felt like God was on my shoulder. And I felt that I was able to speak to God and to feel that he was with me and protecting me and accessible. And this all happened in the span of like 40 minutes. So, what I've seen is that people under the effect of psychedelics are able to retrieve memories, and that's something I experienced numerous times, and make sense of memories that were difficult, informative in a way that allows you to have a clear narrative of your life and to connect the dots of how certain difficult or traumatic events shaped your temperament and personality and relationships. And when you kind of see that picture in a crisper, sort of way, then it becomes a lot easier to make amends, to forgive yourself, to sort of lighten the load. So I think that's essentially what happened to him. He walked away understanding his sexual abuse and the impact that it had on him. And he walked away recognizing there had been like this structural deficit of love, and all of a sudden love was accessible, and it became something that he could now sort of work on and pursue, with eyes wide open. Thanks for your question. Uh-oh.
Hi, Ernesto and Ellen. Thank you so much for a lucid presentation, for really thoughtful discussion questions here. I'm Michael. I work in neuroscience over the medical school, and I study spirituality and religion. And one of the things that we published on is that there's a high degree of similarity between the functional networks in the brain that are associated with spiritual acceptance and the functional networks that are associated with delusions. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to discernment processes. Have there been communities where you've seen a discernment model that you thought really is emblematic of responsible use of the spirituality mixing with psychedelics?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. And I think what happens in the aftermath of a psychedelic experience is your mind becomes malleable for a period of time. So in sort of a good therapeutic container, this can be really fruitful. You can sort of do really, focused work and take advantage of the neuroplasticity that these compounds induce, the disruptive ways of thinking about things. But I've also seen ways in which people can become deluded in the aftermath of these experiences. And I'll give an example. There was this really smart, nice guy at one of the psychedelic retreats I went to in Brazil who, the morning after a really intense journey, he was, walking on cloud 9. He was super happy. And he said, I got a really clear message that I can go off my HIV medications because all I need is, to be with nature. And, I'm not going to do any pharmaceuticals anymore. And ayahuasca told me that I don't need this anymore. So that's like one example of ways in which these states, you kind of enter in the morning after when you kind of think that you were, received an important insight or message, is not inherently therapeutic or healthy. It can lead you astray. Sorry. So I don't know if that gets at the heart of what you were wondering. But, I also think I see considerable potential for some of these communities to take cult-like forms and for people to be manipulated in ways that may be, deeply problematic.
We have a question down here. You could give her the microphone.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I am a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for the Study of World Religions and Indigenous Plant Medicine. And I was wondering, I haven't read your book, but I would like to know your thoughts about cultural appropriation.
Yeah.
Especially since you called the facilitator shaman priestess. Mm-hmm. And then when I saw in the video the whole performance, she was embracing a lot of indigenous ritualistic practice. So I would like to know more about what are your thoughts on that sense, because it's a highly problematic issue.
Totally. Yeah, thank you for asking that question. It's a really good question. And it's something I thought a lot about from the very early stages of sort of becoming interested in this. And there's a handful of chapters in the book that deal directly with this question. I spent some time with an indigenous community in Brazil called the Yawanawa, which came to the brink of extinction in the 1980s and now has been kind of at the forefront of a renaissance of culture, much of it focused on their use of ayahuasca. I think these rituals have changed dramatically even within indigenous communities. So if you kind of look back just a few decades ago, ayahuasca use was typically restricted to, kind of the equivalent of a priest or spiritual elder in tribal communities in both Peru and Brazil. And the sense was that, that these were really, really intricate and powerful compounds and that you really needed mastery to, work with them and that they weren't for everybody. What happened in the last century, though, was that, some outsiders, non-indigenous people, were invited into some of these rituals in Brazil and decided that they wanted to create a different model that was rooted in Christianity. So Santo Daime was kind of the first community that took what had been an indigenous ritual and completely reimagined it and took it out of its indigenous container and, sort of stripped it of that indigenous cosmology. What we've seen more recently is, a lot of Westerners who find themselves in the jungle for one reason or another and partake in these ceremonies walk away transformed, and then either see a business opportunity or walk away feeling that they've received sort of, that they've been tasked with becoming ambassadors of some of these compounds. And it's a really tricky thing, because on the one hand, I don't think you can expect these traditions to remain static. They're always going to be changing and evolving. On the other hand, I do think there's been a failure to do enough to listen to indigenous people, to understand the context in which these ceremonies and rituals emerged, and to harness that wisdom, to be really kind of mindful of how they see this. And they see this as, first and foremost, a spiritual thing. They see this as a portal to the realm of spirits, that can intercede in earthly affairs for good and for evil. And in the way psychedelics are now being discussed, commodified, and used, sometimes I fear that indigenous voices or artifacts are kind of dangled in a way that feels really shallow. They're sort of ornaments rather than, full participants, or something really integral to the experience. So it's a really hard thing. On the other hand, if you look at the history of religions, like no religion lineage has been static. They're always evolving, and people are always borrowing from each other or stealing ideas or threads. So it would be kind of hard to be too dogmatic about, saying nobody should be commodifying or reimagining rituals or the use of substances that began in indigenous communities. I don't think that's realistic. I think the genie is out of the bottle. Does that make sense?
But can I ask you, is religious experiences usually aren't marketed. They're not sold. So how do these things coexist? Is it possible for a profit-making operation to also...
I would push back on that. Yeah. Yeah, I think a lot of religious organizations are motivated by profit. But what makes this different is kind of the fact that it's marketed as a therapeutic intervention, and oftentimes marketed very directly as this is your cure from depression or trauma. Does that make sense? Hello.
Hold on.
God, it's a room full of celebrities tonight.
Yes, you've gathered us here today for sure. I'm Rick Doblin, and I led the organization that negotiated the Phase 3 design for MDMA with the FDA. I'd like to comment on your view that the advocates were so enthusiastic that we biased the science, that the science wasn't really there. And I think the story is exactly the opposite. I also worked on my dissertation at the Kennedy School with the big section on methodology for how you deal with the double-blind problem. And the solution I had was therapy with low-dose MDMA versus therapy with full-dose MDMA. Yep. We spent 16 years in phase 2 studies trying to find the right dose for MDMA that's large enough so that you'd be confusing it with a full dose, but not so large that it would be so therapeutic. And so if we really wanted to bias the science, what we found was that the low doses did produce some blinding, but they compromised the therapy. Mm-hmm. People were uncomfortable. So if you did therapy with no MDMA versus therapy with low dose MDMA, you did better with therapy with no MDMA, with inactive placebo. Now, one of the big critiques of our design was, functional unblinding, which is a major problem. But there's no good solution. So if we wanted to bias the science, we would have told the FDA, let's do therapy with low-dose MDMA versus therapy with full dose. Yep. But we said the low dose actually isn't as strong of a test as to do therapy with no MDMA. And then the FDA chose that design for us to use. So I don't think we were trying to bias the science at all. In fact, we were trying to make the job harder for us. And then you talk about pharma companies. They have financial incentives. They're not these pure people doing these scientific studies. Right. And then the further part is that the double blind is extremely difficult to work and doesn't actually work even in the SSRI studies, that there's the side effect profile. So I think this narrative that somehow or other the therapists were biased, the designs were biased. Just one more example, the second phase 3 study that we did with therapy with inactive placebo, 47.6% of the people no longer had PTSD at the end of the study, compared to 72% that had the MDMA. So the therapists could tell, the patients could tell, but the therapists were doing a great job of trying to really help the patients, even those that didn't get MDMA.
Yep.
Almost half of them did. So I don't think that this narrative that these biased advocates were somehow or other twisting the science to try to get the best results. I don't think that's an accurate reflection of what happened.
Would you agree that there's a strong perception of that among critics?
Sure, yes.
And I think, there's a quote from you in the book, I think, that says, we're not doing science, we're doing political science, or first and foremost, we're doing political science. So I think that has contributed to a sense that this is, politics first, or sort of, something that is driven by a desire to do away with the war on drugs. And the science becomes kind of a means to an end. And I think that is what has made this really thorny from the standpoint of regulators and people who are skeptical.
I think that's completely true. Yes, totally. The early donors that we had for the first 25 years were primarily ones that wanted to end the drug war and saw the medicalization. The same way the medical use of cannabis has led to changing attitudes to lead to the legalization of cannabis.
Right.
So all that part is true. And when I say we do political science, it's the choice of the drug, the choice of the patients. We have bipartisan support for psychedelics, which was primarily because of the work with veterans.
Right.
And so that's where I mean by political science.
Yep.
But then the science has to stand on its own.
Yep.
And that's where I think this initial narrative of we're all advocates and therefore biased, when we enter the FDA realm, it was about trying to make it as rigorous as possible and negotiating with FDA. But I do share that view that that's the narrative that's getting widely propagated. And so my question, I guess, for you is, how is it that there's not been this kind of sort of in-depth look at how we designed these studies, how we arrived at the designs, and why? That seems to have been missed in a lot of the reporting.
I don't know. I mean, I think one thing that would be very useful if somebody is to write the definitive chapter of what went wrong is what the FDA actually said in its rejection. And unfortunately, Lykos, the company that handled the last wave of this, has chosen not to disclose that. But I do think there's value in having a fuller picture of what went wrong. And I agree with you that a lot of the clinicians and researchers who were involved in that PTSD study were very smart and careful scholars. I'm not casting aspersions on their ethics or their motivations. But I do think there was a widespread sense that too many of the people involved in the study, both from a research standpoint and the participants, were people that were really primed to believe that this was going to work and that this was going to be a milestone in a longer quest.
Yeah. So a lot of the criticism was that 40% of the people who had been in the study were prior users of MDMA or ecstasy, and that 60% were not. So I think that's a really valid critique to raise.
Yep.
But the 60% responded the same, who'd never done MDMA, responded the same as the 40% who had.
Yep.
So there was no difference there, either in safety or efficacy. And then the other part of that is that the 40% who had done MDMA before still had PTSD. So it's clearly not in the MDMA.
Right.
And I think a larger part of the challenge for us was that we really said that it's more about the psychotherapy than the drug.
Right.
And that's where we enter into the FDA. That's more about drugs and has never approved psychotherapy. So Tom Insel, who used to be the head of the National Institute of Mental Health, said that the real problem he saw was this promotion of psychotherapy. And he said this psychotherapy by the FDA or others was seen as a bug.
Right.
But he said that should be a feature, that all the research has shown in psychotherapy outcomes if you combine pharmacotherapy with psychotherapy, it works better than either alone.
Right.
So that's, I think, the bigger challenge was this whole prominence of psychotherapy itself.
Yep.
And Deborah Mash, Ibogaine researcher, 30 years or more. I've lost track. But and I've never taken Ibogaine, by the way, and I've always said that publicly. However, when we went in front of the FDA didn't want to have us administer Ibogaine in naive subjects. Mm-hmm. Come on, all right? And it was a safety issue. But if you look at even...
So they only wanted people with previous experience with Ibogaine.
Previous experience.
Which is pretty rare.
The first FDA approval of Ibogaine was in Ibogaine veterans.
Yep.
Rick knows this because he was watching what we were doing. And, so, again, we had to work with the FDA to educate kind of each other on the use of this. If you look at Ibogaine and people, and you made a comment about people entering into treatment and they had the expectation they were going to get better. When people go into addiction treatment, talk to the psychiatrist here. They're ready for change. Yep. They've already made a cognitive map to go for something that's going to give them a benefit. That's part of the therapeutic advantage. When you combine it with a neuroplastogen that opens up this window of neuroplasticity, then you have this advantage to be able to bring about best practices to help the most vulnerable patients in our society to move forward in their life and become functioning human beings, bring families back together. And this is the rhetoric we need. We need these molecules to help the most vulnerable, the people who are not getting care in the most vulnerable communities of our society, who have multi-generational trauma, epigenetic trauma, So we need to be very careful about how this narrative goes. I hope to God that I get to see these molecules become available with qualified clinicians, as my colleague sitting up in front of me here. We need these tools. Big Pharma has not brought us new molecules. We don't have enough tools in the toolbox. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Christine Hauskeller and I work on philosophy and psychedelics. Before that, however, I've worked on genetics and stem cell research. And I think this accusation of the science being political, the phenomenon we struggle with in biomedical research developments generally is that they actually are political in that very sense in which Rick described it, that there is so much money needed to actually create the only kinds of evidence that, as we are now sitting here, we accept as valid evidence for a treatment being efficacious, is so expensive, and so many of these technologies struggle with public acceptance for the tools they use, whether that is human embryos or whether that is genetics. There are so many conflictual issues at play that I think to demand of science to be in that sense unpolitical just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. And I mean, I think one of the structural problems in this field is that it's really hard to raise money to, undergo the kind of FDA studies needed for these tools to be truly integrated in medicine, because, you can't put a trademark on psilocybin or ayahuasca. So, the money tends to come from people who are deeply invested in the sense that these tools work, and it makes it very different than a conventional pharmaceutical.
Thanks so much for your book and for this conversation. This is such a delight. I was really struck by the subtitle, Peril and Promise of Medicinal Psychedelics, and then encountering the role that your own spirituality and that your religious history takes shape through the course of the book. And we pulled in another category of use, recreational use, which I think Michael says in his book, there's nothing casual about recreating yourself. What's recreation, but this sort of thing. So I'm curious what you make of these categories. Are they helpful categories to be using? Medical, religious, recreational? Should we be proliferating further categories, political use, philosophical use? And what you make of this particular collapse in your book of medicine and medicinal use that takes on such a sort of spiritual spiritual dimension, are these actually so separate?
I mean, I think one thing I've encountered is that even if you end up experiencing this first and foremost as a spiritual awakening, that in itself can be really therapeutic. And I think there's plenty of research showing that people who have active and deep religious lives tend to be more resilient and happy. So I think these things do not need to be in conflict. But I think you're getting at the broader question of what other ways can we point to in which these compounds can be helpful? And many people take them now for, creative expansion, and just to, find joy. I've certainly found, glimmers of that in my own exploration. But that was not what drove me initially to these compounds. And that's not where sort of the primary conversation in terms of the regulatory path and how to sort of deal with the fact that these compounds remain illegal is focused. Right now, I think the path of least resistance to make an argument that we should reclassify and reconsider the legal and regulatory standing is rooted in people who are suffering and who may experience profound and fast-acting relief, through these interventions.
So, Dr. Hauskeller, you said part of what I was going to speak to, which is that science and the practice of medicine are highly political exercises. Mm-hmm. And I think what is routinely overlooked, not just with psychedelics, is the degree to which the political interests and the biases of people conducting science and conducting medical research are obfuscated by the supposed objectivity of science. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm a psychiatrist. I spent many years of my life doing everything the system wants me to do to get into medical school, doing everything medical school wanted me to do to get into a good residency, et cetera, et cetera. So you see where I'm going with this. Yep. So it is inconvenient as a psychiatrist to see things in a non-psychiatric way. Yep. The practice of psychiatry is embedded with all sorts of assumptions that our treatments work better than they actually do. We rarely talk about the fact, I work in the emergency room, I hospitalize people, a third of them have schizophrenia. It's always against their will. 7.5% of them are going to be homeless within 3 months of getting discharged. And this is for involuntary hospitalization. 49,000 Americans committed suicide in 2022, topped only by 2023 with 50,000 suicides in this country. So, this is not to be nihilistic about psychiatry, but to be realistic about the limits of what we can do and the ineffectiveness of a lot of our treatments. Of course, that's not to rationalize away bad science if there is bad science, right. But I think we take for granted the things that we just are used to and that we sort of accept and the injustices that are baked into the system. And when something that's really shiny and new comes around, it can be very polarizing where we either look at all the benefits and ignore the harms, or we scarify them into being these terrifying things and ignore the benefits. And I think that's really playing out with psychedelics. They're novel, and it's very difficult to, forgive the pun, look at them in a sober fashion. So I think it's a really big part of the way, the thing that is shaping the debate here in ways that are not very helpful.
I agree. And one thing that struck me in some of these retreats in some of these communities is how vilified psychiatry and mainstream medicine is, how often people have really, really soured on benzos, on SSRIs, on kind of, the frontline intervention tools that are given, readily to patients and that oftentimes do not lead to the desired results. The polarization. Right. Yeah, and there's a deeply ingrained narrative that medicine profits as long as it keeps you chronically ill, and if we were to find a holy grail of an intervention that in the span of a few weeks you can be a transformed person, that's going to be really bad for the bottom line. So I think we should all reflect on the fact that those conversations we're having, and I'm not conspiracy theorist when it comes to medicine. My sister's a psychiatrist. But I do think psychiatrists and psychologists realize that they're stuck and that they're overburdened and that they're not meeting the needs of many, many patients. Thank you for your question.
Last question.
Hi, my name is Rick. Thank you for the talk. Very interesting. I'm a senior here at the college. I study applied math, so quite an amateur in this field, but learning a lot from your book as well. I'm more curious about the post-dosing timeline. So I know that, across the range of psychedelics, some act as like agonists on the same receptors that serotonin binds to. So in a way they mimic the effects, and sometimes they prevent like the serotonin reuptake. I'm curious in your vast experience if you've seen any signs of what I want to call abuse, even though I know that the use profile for psychedelics is much different than drugs we traditionally think of as being abused. And I'm curious if you've seen any, I'll call it abuse cases or dosing very frequently or dosing with negative effects or anything like that.
So I think the one compound where there is a substantial risk of abuse is ketamine, which is not considered to be kind of a so-called classic psychedelic and acts on different receptors in the brain. But it became kind of the beta phase of trying to create a psychedelics therapy, bricks and mortars industry. And I think because there was so much hype and so aggressive marketing, there were people who found a reprieve from suffering in ketamine therapy, which was very costly, and then started getting it in the underground, and that was problematic. When you look at the, the classic psychedelics, things like psilocybin mushrooms and DMT and LSD, these don't tend to have a profile of, great concern for addiction. And I invite any of the experts in the room to challenge me or add to this. But people don't tend to wind up in rehab, because they abuse mushrooms. When you take a mushroom, you typically don't want to do it again the next day. When you drink ayahuasca, it's really, really hard to do it again the next day. So they don't seem to have that, sort of habit-forming trait, which makes this in some ways, safer drugs to study and work with from an addiction standpoint. I think you can close it out.
Great. Thank you
Do
very
you
much.
want to close it out?